Hello, and welcome to the show Writing in the Tiny House. The entire point of this podcast is to help the tormented artist by sharing what I know about writing, publishing, and stress management so that you can have the tools to produce the content that you have been eager to write. If you have the steps in place, you can produce a short story in as few as 3 months or a novel in as few as 18 months. And hopefully through the ideas in this podcast, you will have the wisdom to adjust that timeline if you need to. I am Devin Davis, the guy who lives and writes in a tiny house in northern Utah. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy today's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Preptober, you may be asking yourself. For those of you who do the thing called NaNoWriMo that comes up every November, you may know what Preptober is actually about. NaNoWriMo is the yearly competition or whatever activity. I don't know if you can consider it a competition, but it's a thing where as authors, we set a goal to write 50,000 words in 1 month, in the month of November. And people take this seriously. There are people in this world who stay up until 12 o'clock midnight, November 1st, to start cranking out their word count. Now, granted, at the end of NaNoWriMo, if you have completed your word count, you get a certificate. It's not like we're getting prizes or like prize money, which would be super great, especially considering that we're all penniless authors. But it gets you so much closer to completing your project. Most projects die on the vine in the drafting stage, and NaNoWriMo is a really fun way for a global community of writers to come together and cheer each other on and make really big progress with drafting. If you don't have something to draft, then NaNoWriMo may not be as interesting to you, but it seems that everybody has something to draft, everybody has something to work on in that way. And so even if you're in the middle of a project, I know one author last year who just kind of jumped in and did NaNoWriMo, but he did his word count in the middle of his work in progress and got 50,000 words in addition to what he had written before November 1st, and it totally worked out. I mean, really, it's about writing. It's about drafting. In order to make NaNoWriMo successful, there is an amount of preparation that needs to go into that, just because writing 50,000 words in a month, if you have a full-time job and if you have a lot of other obligations like family and other interests, doing that can be really hard. And putting aside a certain amount of time every day or almost every day in order to draft requires an amount of dedication and an amount of endurance. You get to kind of keep your eye on the prize for the total of a month. I mean, this is largely doing a marathon with composition, with drafting. And so that is why in October we call it Preptober. But Devin, you may ask, we are the final week of September. Yeah. We are starting Preptober a little bit early on Writing in the Tiny House, so I have about 4 episodes after this episode to cover all of the good things about Preptober so that we can dive right into NaNoWriMo on November 1st. And there is just too much to say in 4 episodes, and so I'm taking this additional episode to focus on Preptober. October 1st is here in just a few days anyway, and so I find it prudent to just do that. So we are starting Preptober early. Here's the deal, guys, and there may be some pantsers who listen to this podcast who may kind of want to, strangle me through their iPhone when they hear this, but if you are drafting 50,000 words in 1 month, it is essential to have some form of preparation. I mean, if you don't want to have an outline, that's fine. And if you want to just kind of start and get as far as you can without having any form of forethought, you can always try. But honestly, if you make it to 50,000 words without some form of preparation, that manuscript is going to be all over the place. And considering that first drafts tend to be kind of a garbage fire anyway, I think it's best to give it as good of a chance as you can for it to be as good as it can be. And so that is why we're talking about just some of the different things that you can do. Yes, we are going to have an episode on outlining. It's not going to be this episode. Instead, we're going to talk about some other things that sometimes we just kind of glance over. Today, one of the coolest things that you can have in your prep bag, in your go bag, when November 1st comes and we're all just kind of chomping at the bit to go, is a map. So many of us forget about the map. And the thing is, a map is such a big deal if you are creating a fantasy world or if you are creating just an entirely new world in your fiction. If you turn in your stuff to an editor, they are going to be requesting a map anyway, even if it's just a little rudimentary thing. So with my work in progress, we all know that I am going to be redrafting Tis and expanding it to make it a full-on novel instead of just a novella. That means that I've had to envision some things a little bit differently just because I've had to add an entire new plot line to the story in order to make the story larger and to help out with world building and some other things like that. The main plot line takes place largely in one city. In my book, that city is called Carbridge, and because in the novella, it was just kind of a basic introduction to what Carbridge is and what happens there, I had not taken time to sit and figure out what the ins and outs of the city actually look like. But because this other plot line takes place largely in Carbridge and in different areas of the city, it was so prudent for me to sit down and figure out the different sections of the city. And so I am going to be talking about Incarnation today, which is an online map building platform. They are not sponsoring this episode. I am simply talking about how awesome it is to have that tool. So with Incarnation, you pick a landscape and you can fill it in as much as you want with kind of whatever you want. If you want the houses, if you want the buildings, the temples, the university, the alchemist thing, like the Thieves Guild, all of it is focused largely on fantasy and not so much on science fiction. And so you get kind of an older world feel. But friends, it is so good to lay out a city. So with me, I knew where the big points were, and so I started just kind of putting in where things go. A lot of this happens in the courthouse, and I knew where the courthouse was in relation to other things, but to see it and to actually have a map of it is really cool to me. I know that if somebody stands on the front stoop of the courthouse, which in elevation is far higher than the rest of Carbridge, I know exactly what they are looking out on. I know what they can see in their line of sight. And it's cool to just know that, just because I can see it on the map. It's like, oh, the Circle of Temples is just over there. The old bridge is up there. The new bridge is back this other way. Just because we're using French naming conventions of bridges. Just different things like that is so beneficial, and it makes the world even more real to me. So then I can go through and reference that when I'm talking about where they go and how they get there and the different things within the city and how to get there if they need to see the alchemist or if they need to visit one of the temples in the Circle of Temples or whatever. It's all there. And so I highly recommend that you use something like Incarnate. There is a free version of it if you want to just kind of get into it. There is a larger version, a paid version that I use that, in my opinion, has been worth it. It's been a good thing. And then you get rights to use your map. I personally don't think that I'm going to be using this version of the map to put into my book. I think that I will, though, have this map ready to give to an artist who can sketch a map from there, just because. I feel that with my book, it gets to have a more original thing, but this is a valuable tool to get there. I can simply send them this file and tell them, a blurb about each of the areas of the map that I've created, and then they can go ahead and work their magic as an artist to recreate something in a style that more suits the tone of my book. So because this is 1760 and it's not so much medieval stuff or super old world stuff like we see in something like World of Warcraft, there gets to be a certain feel about the map that will need to happen with original artwork, which is fine. Also, if you're doing a science fiction thing and so you need a more futuristic approach, like I said, those icons are not necessarily available through Inkarnate, but you can still use what they have as a way to just kind of get a reference. And then you'll have something ready to turn into an artist if you need to incorporate that into more original artwork into your stuff later. And take it from me, having a big idea of what your city looks like is super great, and it's already going to be easier to write about when I start drafting in November. And having a map ready, my map is not entirely ready yet, but having a map ready is going to be a huge benefit and a really big tool in my go bag, so to speak, when November 1st happens. So that is what I encourage you to do today, is to log on to something like Inkarnate, there are others available too, and start creating your map so that you can be ready for NaNoWriMo. And that is it for today. Go ahead and follow me on social media. On Instagram, I am at Author Devin Davis. On Twitter, I am at Author Devin D. And I also have an account on TikTok. Go ahead and find my information in the show notes of this episode. And remember that my short story Brigitte, which was published last fall, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible as an audiobook. Go ahead and check those things out today. And be sure to join me on next week's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.